Well, hello there, my young friends. It's Mr. Johnson here at Westlake High School, classroom 408, here in Johnson Land. I'm going to just share with you three very simple short stories over a couple of days. If you're unable to be in class for either of those days, these videos of my reading the stories and discussing the characters and whatnot should maybe help for you to know what's going on. In this particular video, just one story. It's called The Open Window by Saki, and it's the first story in your packet of three short stories. Really, the story centers around a man called Frampton Nuttall. That is his name, Frampton Nuttall. And a 15-year-old girl named Vera who welcomes him into her aunt's home as he is visiting. Let's see what happens. It's The Open Window by Saki. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuttall endeavored to say the correct something, which should duly flatter the niece of the moment, without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. Frampton is a very nervous person. Today we might consider him someone with social anxiety disorder. It's very hard for him to go to visit a stranger, for example, to go into a new social setting and just talk to people and whatnot. So it's been kind of prescribed to him to visit, and he happens to be visiting this house for his nerve cure. I know how it will be, his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. Excuse me. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Mrs. Sappleton is the name of the aunt of the young lady that welcomes him at the door. And Frampton has a letter of introduction just to meet her because his sister had been in this area before. And then through her, he's basically meeting these new people and just trying to deal in a social setting. Do you know many of the people around here? Asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. Hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister was staying here at the rectory, you know, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, pursued the self-possessed young lady. Only her name and address, admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. Her tragedy? Asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. It is quite warm for this time of year, said Frampton, but has the window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through the window 3 years ago to a day. Her husband and her 2 young brothers went out for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back someday, they and the little brown spaniel that was with them, and walk in that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt. She has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing Birdie, Why Do You Bound, as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will walk in through that window. So, according to this young lady, his sister, Frampton's sister, wouldn't have known about this tragedy. This tragedy happened a year ago to this day. I'm sorry, 3 years ago to this day, and the sister had been there 4 years earlier. That this poor lady had lost her husband and her 2 younger brothers when they had been out hunting for snipe. Snipe is a kind of bird, I believe. And They were coming back, and they basically all sank in a treacherous bog. We would call it a marsh, and they didn't make it home. And after every afternoon, this poor lady, just wishing they would come back, opens this big window, hoping for them to come in. And Frampton's probably thinking to himself, this is terrible that I would choose today to visit these people on the anniversary of such a tragedy. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will come home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for ducks in winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk to a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that the hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid a visit on this tragic anniversary. He's trying to be polite. He's already feeling very awkward because it's hard for him to visit with strangers. That's his nerve disorder and whatnot. And he happened to show up on the anniversary of these people's deaths, and she's barely even paying attention to him. She's looking out the window, and he's just thinking, poor lady, this is all very, very awkward and uncomfortable for him. So he tries to make conversation, but he's not very good at it. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No," said Mrs. Sappleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last," she cried, "just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they were muddied up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run to the hedge to avoid imminent collision. When Frampton is talking to this woman, she's not paying attention to him. Suddenly he looks past her and sees 3 people and a dog coming toward the window that were supposed to be dead. And he's thinking he sees ghosts, and he just completely freaks out. He runs out the room, and he almost hits somebody on a bicycle on the way out, and he's just completely beside himself because he thinks he's seen ghosts. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh coming in through the window, fairly muddy, but most of it dry. "Who was that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Sappleton. "Could only talk about his illnesses and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." Of course, he thought he saw several ghosts. And then, of course, Vera chimes in like this. "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted in a cemetery somewhere in the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve." See, romance at short notice was her specialty. And basically romance, just making up stories on the spot, was her specialty. When she realized Frampton's sister wouldn't have been there since the tragedy, she makes up the story about 3 years ago to this day that these 3 men were coming into the window because she knew at any moment they'd be coming into the window. So she convinced Frampton he was seeing ghosts. And then as he leaves and runs out like that, she makes up a story about it. The reason he freaked out was he saw the dog and he'd been trapped by dogs at some point, because Vera's just really good at making up stories and just, messing with people and whatnot. That, my friends, is The Open Window by Saki. fairly easy story to read and to understand. Hope you'd enjoy it. Thanks for reading, and thanks for watching. Okay, bye.